Welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast. I'm your host, Matt ZAUN. Thank you for joining us as we uncover how stories are one of the most important aspects of your business. We'll talk about struggles, victories, and how you can utilize strategic storytelling to inspire those around you to action. Enjoy this episode. Being in the political world for over a decade, writing speeches for elected officials and coaching politicians, there's always been a topic that has fascinated me. An important topic not only for politicians, but also for business leaders, especially today as well. And that is the topic of crisis management. And that's the topic that we're going to focus on today, because today I am joined by GINA FURIA RUBEL, who's the president and CEO of FURIA RUBEL Communications Incorporated. She's a high-stakes public relations and reputation and crisis advisor. And if that wasn't interesting enough, her organization was named the #1 legal marketing agency in the entire Philadelphia region. GINA, welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, Matt.
I'm very excited to dive in today because I get a lot of questions about crisis management, about how to do it. What is it? I mean, where do we even start from a lot of organizations? So I'm really excited to dive in and hear a lot of the experiences that you've had over the years with clients. So to kick us off, I'm going to start with an extremely controversial question, because I'm sure that I'm going to get a lot of heat for this. I might need to do crisis management myself, but knowing that you are in the Philadelphia area, one of the questions I get all the time when people know that I'm from Philadelphia is they say, where do I get the best cheesesteaks in Philly? So where do you think the best cheesesteaks in Philadelphia are?
Oh gosh, it changes all the time, but it's none of the top ones that people talk about in downtown Philadelphia. I've always loved D'Alessandro's, which is up in the Roxborough section of Philadelphia. Sorry, Pat's and Gino's. I know I grew up going there after school all the time, but D'Alessandro's nails it.
Awesome. I was just there not too long ago, and you're absolutely right. They do make a fantastic product. One of the things when I'm talking to people around the US that I know when they come to Philly, they're going to do touristy stuff, I always recommend Sonny's because it's close to Independence Hall. It's like a 5-minute walk. I love Sonny's. I think it's really good. But yeah, absolutely. If people aren't doing touristy and they would just want to go for a great cheesesteak, D'Alessandro's, absolutely. If you are by Independence Hall, Sonny's is really quick. Highly recommend.
Well, and also Reading Terminal Market. I'm blanking on the name of the one in there. Is it DeNick's?
Yes.
It might be. Okay, DeNick's. Yeah. And, COVID, I have that COVID brain still, even though we're way past it. I haven't been in the Reading Terminal Market in a while because of us all working more virtually. But
sure.
If you come to Philly, here's my problem. If you're going to talk about cheesesteaks, you go to other cities all over the US and in other countries, and it says Philly cheesesteak, and they have a roll that is god awful. It's not soft. It doesn't soak up the all of the essence, and they cut like whole steaks up in pieces.
Sure.
That's not a cheesesteak. It's just not a cheesesteak. And so what I didn't tell you, Matt, is I grew up in South Philly. So awesome. I am a South Philly Italian girl at heart. That's where my roots are. So I think I've had a few cheesesteaks in my lifetime.
Wow. Well, so that is a riveting recommendation then that you just threw out there. So that is awesome. I highly recommend people check that out. So speaking of Philadelphia, one of the things that I love about Philadelphia is the deep, rich history. And I love walking the streets of Philadelphia and looking at all of these historical buildings and just thinking to myself about all of the incredible orators and debaters and individuals that really forged the way forged the way, the path, if you will, to build the kind of government we have here in the US. And these individuals knew the power of words, and they realized that you could live or die by your words. And the same is true with organizations. Organizations, if they are really good at crafting messages, they're going to radically succeed. And if they say things that maybe shouldn't have been said and they don't understand how to properly deal with the fallout, it could completely destroy and cripple an organization. And I always get that feeling when I'm walking in Philadelphia because of that deep history. And I know you know the power of words. And I know that you've seen what words can do in a really bad way for people that aren't willing to adhere to the different things that you teach. So I want to dive into crisis management with you because it is very intriguing, and it's going to be very intriguing to my listeners. And first, I want to start with the picture of what crisis management is, because I think when we hear those words, we all have a different picture in our mind. So to you, what is a really good picture of crisis management?
Well, what's interesting is you need to define what a crisis is, first of all. And there's a really big difference between a crisis and an incident. And, an incident is something that could rise to the level of a crisis, but not all matters are a crisis. And I start there because so many times CEOs and executives immediately go into crisis mode before the whole situation has been evaluated. So a crisis is a situation that can bring down a company, puts people in harm's way, can have a long-term effect on the employees, customers, public. So there's something much bigger than an incident. An example, last week, a car caught on fire outside a mall in a little shopping center. I live in an area named Doylestown. For your listeners, I'm sure they're all over the world. It's outside of Philadelphia. That's an incident. There was a response. Nobody got hurt. There was some messaging around it. The next day it was in the newspaper and it's done and gone. It's over. Then whoever owned the car will deal with our insurance company and so on and so forth. That's an incident. A crisis is, how do companies with interests in Russia deal with it in light of Russia's war in Ukraine, of their invasion, and what does that mean to their company? What does it mean to their employees? What does it mean to their reputation? That's a crisis. That's a real crisis. And then there are hundreds of other types of crises. Pre-pandemic, if you asked me what a crisis was, I probably wouldn't have said pandemic. And what's interesting for your listeners is we've all learned what a crisis looks like.
Sure.
More so than ever before. Crisis management during the pandemic was, how soon do you lock down? How do you get your employees who can work from home, working from home? What do you do if they have to be in your workspace? All that was a crisis. And it continues to be.
Sure. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. Yeah, I really appreciate you setting the groundwork, because I feel like people play these different stories that they've heard in a mind loop regarding crisis. So something will happen, or a leader will say something, and they immediately go to what they heard in the news about someone saying something and their business was destroyed. And they think crisis, crisis, crisis. So I really appreciate you mentioning the difference between crisis and incident. So just to clarify, make sure that I'm hearing you correctly, an incident is something that's frustrating. It's something that you can deal with, but more than likely there is a very limited time frame for when it will be over. And then a crisis is truly something that could dismantle someone's organization. Is that correct?
Or someone's life,
or someone's life. Okay.
A crisis. So some crisis matters can have a shorter time frame, like a life-threatening situation. Let's say you have an active shooter on site.
Sure.
that can have a very short life in terms of the crisis itself, but it can affect lives. So
Sure.
it's really understanding the level to which something rises. A lot of companies think a crisis is losing an executive. Most of the time it's an incident
Sure.
that if people don't act like it's a crisis, doesn't have to become a crisis.
Sure. Sure.
So
Sure.
it's very dependent on the situation and the severity of the potential outcomes. I think that's the way I would, some have, a short time frame as an outcome, but I would say it's the severity of the potential outcomes.
So let's talk about a short-lived incident that could have massive negative effects. So let's use a restaurant as an example. So imagine a national restaurant chain. They're in all 50 states. They have really good branding. They have regular reoccurring customers. And unfortunately, someone gets severely ill due to one of their products. They eat one of their products, they get very, very ill. And now, due to social media, that person puts it out, they tweet it out, or they put it out on another social media platform. It goes viral. And now that company's in damage control because now a lot of their customers are getting freaked out. Am I going to get sick? First, would you consider that a crisis, or could that elevate to a crisis? And what would be the first thing that you would recommend that company do?
Okay, great question. Great example. We've all seen that happen many times over the years. The first thing, it's not a crisis yet.
Okay.
Okay, it's not a crisis yet. Now, I would say it's probably a crisis if the person who got ill died. But if a person got ill, it's not a crisis, but it can become. The very first thing, which some of these things have to happen well in advance of these potential situations coming up, which is creating a crisis management team or a crisis response team. And they're both synonymous. So that team, you need to know who they are and what their roles are. Every company should have a list of who's on their crisis team and what their cell phone numbers are. If they still have home phone numbers, their home phone numbers. And where a crisis will be managed from. So on that team, you would have the CEO, you would have the director of corporate communications or the CMO, you would have their in-house counsel or general counsel. You would have, if it's an incident at one location, you're also going to need to have, if it's a franchise, the franchise owner. If it's not a franchise, the management from that location, because we're talking about a restaurant with 50 locations perhaps, or locations all over the 50 states. So you might need, so I'm going to talk about crisis response team in general and then go back to your scenario. You might need an IT person involved. You might need security people involved. Again, it depends on the type of crisis, but they all need to be identified well in advance of a situation arising. Of that list, you also need to know who the spokesperson will be and who the alternate spokesperson is. And that's really important. So now we'll go back to your scenario. Restaurant, somebody gets ill, blasts it all over social media. Most companies that size will also have a crisis response plan. So it identifies who the players are internally, then it identifies how you handle different situations. First and foremost, what's changed in the last 20 years is the speed with which companies need to respond. Previously, they might have had a few hours, might have waited for a media crew to show up on their front steps. Now it's minutes. It's minutes.
For sure.
And so they need to have some prepared statements, what we call holding statements, that can be edited and know who's going to approve them. So a holding statement might be, it has come to our attention that someone, fell ill. We are investigating the matter. and we'll do everything to make sure that our food and customers are safe. So it's the messaging, and what you are the expert in, Matt, as well, is how we use words.
Sure.
And so it's really about how those words are said, what they say, and the person delivering them.
Sure.
So if somebody gets sick and they say, well, we don't believe they got sick and we think they just are trying to file an insurance claim. Now you have all of social media blowing up, and this company,
Sure.
they're now we're in crisis, right?
Sure. All right. So I appreciate you painting that picture for us, because I'm sure there are some people listening to this that they think this is a good idea in theory, but they may not act on it. And I would really challenge them, because you and I have both worked with individuals that they work their guts out to build something incredible, to build an incredible organization that they're proud of. And a lot of these people, they pour into their staff. They really, really help their clients, and they're doing good in the world. And some people have spent decades doing this, and it could all be lost in minutes if they don't truly know what they're doing when it comes back to what you said about creating a crisis response team. Like, literally something could happen that's no fault of their own. And because of what you had mentioned about social media, things blowing up and really going viral in a matter of minutes, if they don't have some type of plan together, what they worked blood, sweat, and tears for potentially decades could all be crumbled within a very short turnaround time. So based on what you said, Gina, would you recommend people go through like almost like role-playing scenarios once they get this crisis response team together, like go over different holding statements, go over different potential things that could happen just to get them ready? Or do you think that's going overboard?
Oh, no, not at all. So most of our clients, we've written their strategic plans, their incident response plans. They have scenarios written out for just about every type of matter that could happen under the sun. And then we do what we call scenario training or tabletop training. So smart companies do that as a matter of course. If they're not doing it, there's a problem. And so, and that's what your listeners need to get out of this. And the funny thing, Matt, is before we started recording, I shared with you that the one thing I never would talk to clients about would be, having to manage a potential pandemic. Of course, that was pre-2020.
Sure.
Because it wasn't something we had ever dealt with. And, now every client has a pandemic management plan. So if any listener thinks they're immune from any type of crisis, look back at the weather patterns, how they've changed, the pandemic and what we've had to deal with, the war in Ukraine and how it's affecting every part of every business. That's
Sure.
probably, and business executive listening to this, we have to plan. It's the same reason why you get insurance. Hopefully none of our listeners are driving a car without insurance or running a business without the proper insurance. A crisis or incident response plan is the same thing as insurance. It's helping you to manage quickly and efficiently, and it's getting buy-in so that you don't have to wait.
Sure.
The biggest problem is trying to get a statement out in minutes when there's 10 people who need to review it and respond. If general counsel has already reviewed it and the CEO has already approved it, and you change 3 words, you already have their buy-in. You send it, they approve it, it's done, it goes, it's issued.
Sure.
We can't not have response plans, period.
Sure. That's a really good point. And to give a really very real example that I personally lived, because it's bringing back horrors, but it's just something that has been on my mind for quite some time, where I'm still dealing with this in my area. So the area that I live in, you had mentioned different weather patterns. The area that I live in experienced a devastating flood a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
We have all gotten flood insurance and seen 100-year flood, right? If there's a 100-year flood that comes, and we always think that the 100-year flood's going to happen in 80 years from now when we're all in the grave. We never think that it's going to happen to us, right? There were business leaders that I know, being in the local business community in the area that I'm in, that they almost jovial laughed it off what they were seeing in the news. Okay. Basically, you know, a lot of people were telling us that there was going to be a major flood. And oh, we've heard that before. It's almost like, you know, the little boy that cries wolf. We've heard it again and again and again. And there are different business entities in my area that never experienced any kind of water in their establishment. So they brushed it off. They didn't think anything of it. Well, then the storm came and had major, major, major horrific things, fallout that happened from that. There are businesses that they still have not recovered. They haven't opened. There were numerous homes that never got an ounce of water were completely wiped away due to water. Now, what happens after that? In my opinion, that's a crisis because a lot of these businesses got knocked out. There was a lot of messaging that was not properly done by different government agencies, by different nonprofits that were helping. There were a lot of different things that happened. And oh, by the way, we've had flooding issues in this area, not to that magnitude before, but we've had flooding issues. So the fact that there was not a crisis response team within a lot of these different entities just speaks back to what you're saying by saying, oh, this will never happen to us. We can laugh this off. We've gotten water in this area before, but we've never gotten that type of flooding. Well, they had a real wake-up call when that happened. So you know, that's a story that I can share. Is there something that you can point back to, Gina, in the last 20 years that you basically were trying to get a client to do something, they didn't listen to you and it didn't go well? Can you think of anything in particular?
Well, you know, I think a big one that we've all seen, and you know, you mentioned floods. It's a lot of natural disasters.
Sure.
You know, natural disaster is a big one, but I'll share. You know, start with looking at all the different types of crises that are out there. We have people who aren't clients, but coronavirus didn't go very well for them. Whereas we represent a senior living community, and we were monitoring what was happening in Seattle. And, you know, the news was coming out that people were dying in senior living facilities. And we immediately had conversations with the executive director and said, it's time to shut down. You have to lock down. And they were locked down about 2 weeks before Pennsylvania went lockdown. And wow. Families were pissed, and everybody's, you know, and we're like, your job, your duty is to protect the people who work there and live there. You have one job. We can handle all that messaging. We can handle angry people. But what's going to really hurt is if people start dying needlessly. And so, you know, you really have to think about, you know, that's a positive story. Yeah, I mean, there are times where things don't go well, especially when clients don't want to listen or they think they know better.
Sure.
Or frankly, they put emotion into it instead of empathy.
Sure.
You know, or get angry and let people see that, or don't have a plan. You know, another one that handled the pandemic really well is a client, a rather large law firm. They're in 13 states, headquartered in New Orleans, but they had been through Hurricane Katrina and, you know, devastated during Hurricane Katrina. As a result, put all new procedures in place for work from home, office shutdowns, because they live in an area that gets a lot of hurricanes. When they didn't miss a beat when the pandemic hit, not a beat. And it was fascinating to watch how they were ready. Look, we're handling this just like a hurricane. Everybody go home, get your laptops. You're going to be working from home. We don't know how this is going to play out. So, you know, we will be in touch with you on a daily basis. What's most important is the health and safety of your families, and those of our clients. And they did not miss a beat. So
that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, I mean, and I think natural disasters are probably where every listener should start. You mentioned the flood you dealt with. I live in an area that doesn't get tornadoes, except for the last couple of years, where one went up our street. I was standing where I am now. I watched debris flying around my backyard.
Wow.
My neighbor and friend's house was leveled. Oh yeah, and the hospital that's just down the road, it broke some windows of the hospital, jumped over the hospital, hit the daycare that's owned and run by the hospital.
Oh my
gosh. The CEO of the hospital was running Saving Children.
Wow.
Okay. They're just rebuilding. What year was it when the Doylestown got hit? It was 3 years ago, I think. Wow. 2-3 years ago. They're just rebuilding the daycare there. So, if you think you're immune, no matter how big your institution is, you're not. Sure. And that's really the thing. We don't know what's coming if you plan for it. And I'm going to give you a really simple example. Do you have children?
I do. I have 3.
Okay. Do you tell your children in case of a fire where to go outside?
Sure. I mean, we've gone through different exercises before.
Okay. Why do you do that?
Because fires can happen. Fires happen every day across the country, and God forbid if it happens, they'll know, hey, here are the doors. Here's where you run.
Right. Why do schools do fire drills and corporate buildings do fire drills? So my point is very simple. It's no different than protecting your family or for protecting the people in your building. Crisis planning is a fire drill.
Sure.
And I like to bring it down to that very common denominator. When my kids were little, they're both in college, one's graduating soon. We had here's where you go in the case of a fire. Here's how you get out, and here's where you go on the property. We will find you there.
Sure.
And we live on a small farm. And so we have a gazebo out away from the buildings. You go to the gazebo. No matter what time it is, no matter what your clothes are, you go there.
Sure.
And it's no different. So I encourage listeners to think about crisis planning like you would a fire drill. Sure. And keeping everyone safe no matter the circumstances, even if it's litigation. And litigation can bring down a company.
Sure.
We've seen it in so many different cases where, we saw it in the Sandy Hook matter, for example, and, what happened there and who brought litigation and why. I'm not going to talk about the politics around it, but more about, who was to blame and are kids safe in school? And, there's so many issues there to unpack. And
sure.
I don't think either of us want to get into a political conversation.
So, I appreciate all the examples that you had mentioned. I actually want to dive a little bit more into the first one that you gave. You had mentioned the senior living facility, and you had made the comment, I'm paraphrasing, but you had made the comment that basically you had shut down 2 weeks prior to other entities in the state shutting down, and there were a lot of frustrated family members. So let's say that an entity, they have created a crisis response team based on your recommendation. They have everything in place. They have the holding statements. They've done the tabletop training. They have everyone they need to have. They're ready to go for almost anything that could happen under the sun. In that instance, obviously, that senior living facility that listened and adhered to your advice they were doing well a couple months later as far as from a messaging perspective, because now they can say, look at what happened and look what we were able to do. What would you recommend companies that are really ready for these crises, that when they happen, how do they use that as a marketing PR opportunity, but not touting their horn too much to where they're going to alienate people? What kind of messages would you recommend they craft to show the world, hey, like, we were ready, we made sure people were safe, we got all our ducks in a row, but doing it in a way that's going to endear people to them and not alienate? What would you recommend in that instance?
Well, I would recommend first training people in your company, the salespeople, on what the data really is, and letting them start with having those as conversations with potential customers.
Okay.
A lot of things have to be tested in a soft sell first. A lot of companies will come out and say, oh, I want to put out a press release about this. And you're like, well, how about you start with messaging and see how it goes when you're talking to customers, potential customers. If people felt, people who are the recipient of good choices felt safe, give them the opportunity to share their stories, whether it be online reviews, for example. You might just have a conversation at the lunch table or at dinner time and say, we're really proud of how we all work together. If any of you are interested in sharing that in a review, we would all appreciate it. No pressure. Sometimes there are ways to let stories tell themselves.
Sure.
There are times to pat yourself on the back. Look, I own a PR and marketing agency. We do a lot of public relations. There are times to pat yourself on the back, and there are times to let others do it for you. And that, why I said about the tornado, when the hospital and the daycare was hit, they are in my community, and I'm very connected with a lot of the executives. So I knew what was going on at the time. Sure. However, there was a beautiful story written up about how the CEO, the media was out there. They were out there. They saw him carrying a child.
Wow.
They told the story, and let that story flourish, and that's okay. Sure. Because it's human, and it's really gets down to the basics of empathy. But those messages need to be tested a little bit. I think too many companies are out there trying to pat themselves on the back. When we had the racial incident in Philadelphia with Starbucks, if Starbucks came out and said, oh, well, we're going to pat ourselves on the back for changing our policies and giving new training. No, instead, they worked really hard to provide DE&I training, to look at what some of the issues were, to make better inroads for for customer service. Then that story can be told.
Sure. I really appreciate you mentioning that. Allow the story to be tested, because as you know, there's a lot of companies that when they think they've done something good in regard to crisis management, they want to go and they want to tell every news outlet on the sun. They want to do press releases out the wazoo. They want to do interviews on podcasts. They want to just crank all this information. And what's interesting is sometimes those stories can fall flat because they may be excited about them, but the community in general is not as excited. So I really appreciate you mentioning the testing of it.
Worse yet is they don't fall flat, but they have a negative effect.
Sure, they could backfire for sure.
And we don't want things to backfire. And so this goes back to that idea of tabletops, right? When you're doing your training, if you're doing strategic storytelling workshops and you're teaching someone how to tell a story better, you don't just tell them, you work with them.
Sure.
They deliver their stories. They're testing them. You're refining it.
Sure.
Right? They're not
Absolutely.
Just videotaping themselves and putting themselves on TikTok tomorrow. So it's a process.
Sure. Yeah. And I appreciate you mentioning that, because to me, it's all about showing. Because people can understand something from a theoretical perspective and think it's amazing, but until they've done it, that's where the showing comes in. That's why I don't even say I help people anymore. I show them. Helping's one thing, showing's another. I like to show people how to do it. And that's what you do as well. You're showing people how to do all the different things that they do. So I really appreciate what you do. Before we wrap up, I just want to let you know, I really appreciate this conversation. I learned a ton. I learned a ton from talking to you. In the brief amount of time that we went through this, I learned a ton. So I just want to go through my key takeaways that I challenge everyone listening to really focus on. You had mentioned there is a difference between a crisis and an incident. I think business leaders really need to understand that, what you said about not everything that happens is a crisis. More than likely, what they're thinking of as an incident, they don't want it to advance to that crisis stage. You also mentioned creating a crisis response team, having the right people a part of that crisis response team, having holding statements where they're figuring out different things that may happen, getting ready for in the event it happens, and then actually going through different trainings and showing their people through tabletop trainings how to kind of get through something that could happen. In addition, the third thing that I really got out of it was allowing the story to be tested. So once they do well handling an incident or a crisis, instead of touting it out to the world, testing it in smaller messaging versus the full scale. So those are my three takeaways. So I know a lot of people got a lot out of this conversation. I really appreciate it. Now, Gina, with everything said, if there is someone that wants to get more information on what you do, what your organization does, they're very interested in the PR stuff that you do in the crisis management, where's the best place that they can go to find you?
Well, I would say go to our website. It's www.furiarubel.com, or check out our podcast on recordpr.com.
Okay.
Both places where we give crisis counsel. And more importantly, listen to your podcast as well.
Thanks. I appreciate that. So to make it extremely convenient for people, I'll put all of that in the show notes. People could just click and find out more information on you and what your organization does. But again, thank you so much for your time, Gina. I very much appreciate it.
And I appreciate you, Matt. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you have a story that you would like to share, feel free to drop an email to matt@mattzahn.com with the subject line Stories with Traction. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share tons of resources on how you can be a better storyteller. Remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.